Coming up, India investors. New Delhi allows foreign investors direct access to its equity market. Global Economic Review. And today we'll show you the last part of our yearly review, focusing on company news and devastating disasters. Hello and welcome to Economy Report. I'm Daniel West in Beijing. As the Eurozone's third largest economy, Italy is crucial to the bloc's survival. But Rome is now undergoing its worst economic crisis since 2001. Italian Prime Minister Mario Monti has started a series of economic reforms, trying to drag his country out of the crisis. Italy's situation remains precarious, however, and many of its citizens are understandably pessimistic. CNC's correspondent takes you there for a closer look.
A survey conducted by a leading Italian business group shows nearly 48% of Italians are pessimistic about the country's situation, and 36% expect the impact on their families to be more serious in 2012. According to trade unions, 300,000 workers risk losing their jobs during 2012, and the unemployment rate will be around 9%.
25% of the Italian people are at poverty risk. Istat, the Italian National Agency for Statistics, said that if every 4 persons, 1 are at poverty risk, the 6.9% of the Italian people are already below the poverty level. Mr. Mario Monti, the Italian Prime Minister, has started his economic reform to save Italy from the crisis. But that reform will affect mainly the middle class. It means that there will be more economical problem for Italian family, and that the 25% of poverty risk could increase in 2012.
The Italian government has conducted a series of reforms, including tough austerity measures, to revive the economy. Pensioners have been hard hit by these austerity measures. Some of them can't even afford the costs of daily life.
You have to stay on a budget. You must be careful what you eat. We don't go to the cinema. We don't go to restaurants. I don't know how they will resolve this situation, but it's very bad. There are pensioners who don't have money, and they have to go to markets looking for food that's meant to be thrown away. And that is depressing for people who have worked for many years. Being an elderly person, we no longer have the satisfactions that we were used to.
In Italy, small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of the country. However, the ongoing economic crisis has forced people to cut their spending, in particular on clothing and shoes, as well as homewares and holidays.
The Christmas period had a sales drop of 13% compared to last year. People were very worried, so this decline is significant. There was a slight recovery from the second half of December, but it was too late to recover. Even if people haven't suffered from the crisis, they have chosen to protect themselves, to put the money under the brick rather than spend it. And this is the perspective that people have.
Our Christmas was definitely not good. We now are working for the sales, and we hope customers will take advantage of the discounts, as they did before. We can't pay suppliers if we can sell. This is the situation we're facing now. They put Mr. Monti in to make reforms, but they have done nothing except taking more money from the poor. This only widens the gap between the rich and poor. The rich will always be rich, and the poor will get poorer. I hope a lot in Prime Minister Mario Monti. Monti is a serious person, but the government always asks sacrifice from the same people, always us. Now they put the fees on the house. I want to be optimistic, but for me, it's not a real optimism. We're optimistic just because the government tells us to be, but it will be tough.
Last week, Prime Minister Mario Monti launched Phase 2 of the austerity measures. Following the first €30 billion package, the new plan will focus on the labor market and boosting jobs.
Spain's new economy minister says the country will take further measures to reduce its deficit. His remarks follow last Friday's proposal of public spending cuts and tax increases. Let's have the details.
Luis de Guindos, the new Spanish economy minister, says he expects Spain to end the year of 2011 with a public deficit of around 8%. Despite previous expectations of a 6% deficit, the Guindos confirms that the figure could be over 8%. The minister also says Spain cannot afford the luxury of 8% without government taking austerity measures. He adds that the government will release the exact figures in a week. At the same time, the minister implies that there will be more austerity measures for Spain to adopt in the near future. He says Spain has a very aggressive reform agenda to carry out in the coming weeks and months. Last Friday, Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy's new government proposed a sweeping package of cost-cutting measures and tax increases. The package includes 8.9 billion euros in public spending cuts in 2012 for all ministries, as well as freeze of the country's current monthly minimum wage of 641.4 euros. The government will also freeze recruitment of civil servants in 2012, with no replacements for anyone leaving their positions, in addition to rises in income tax.
The Indian government has now allowed foreign nationals to invest directly in the country's stock markets, even if they are overseas. Economy Reports has more.
The Indian government has decided to allow foreign individual investors, pension funds and trusts to invest directly in equities. The country's finance ministry said on Sunday in a statement that it has now been decided to allow qualified foreign investors, or QFIs, to directly invest in the Indian equity market. The statement says a large number of qualified foreign investors, including individual foreign nationals, didn't have direct access to the Indian equity market, despite wanting it. They found difficulties investing in the Indian equity market. The ministry says the move will widen the class of investors, attract more foreign funds, reduce market volatility, and deepen the Indian capital market. Previously, foreigners were only allowed to invest in mutual fund schemes. Those who wanted to invest in Indian stock markets had to come through the sub-account route. New Delhi's move came at a time when foreign investors are withdrawing from Indian equity markets due to problems in their domestic markets.
Now a review of the top economic stories of 2011, only on CNC World. In addition to debt woes, the world economy was sorely tested by Mother Nature in 2011. In February, the New Zealand city of Christchurch was shaken by a 6.3 magnitude earthquake. JP Morgan estimated it was the third costliest natural disaster worldwide since 2008. Less than a month later, northeastern Japan was devastated by an earthquake and tsunami. In addition to over 15,000 deaths and 125,000 damaged or destroyed buildings, Japan's economy was also crippled by a meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear plant. Ensuing power shortages ate into Japanese firms' productivity, and nuclear companies worldwide were hit by voter and investor skepticism over their safety. European power firms E.ON and RWE saw their stocks plummet, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel did a huge U-turn on nuclear power, closing 8 of the country's reactors and promising to phase out the rest by 2022. 3 months later, Thailand was hit by its worst floods in half a century. The Southeast Asian manufacturing hub was temporarily paralyzed, with knock-on effects for global supply chains. Aside from causing an immediate downturn in the afflicted countries, each disaster has long-term implications for the global economy. Let's now take an in-depth look at their consequences.
In March, Japan was faced with its biggest crisis since the end of the World War II. A 9-magnitude earthquake struck on March the 11th near Japan's Honshu Island, about 130 kilometers east of Miyagi Prefecture. But the worst was yet to come. The largest earthquake ever to hit Japan triggered a massive tsunami, which swept ashore on Japan's northeastern coast. As if these twin disasters weren't awful enough, Japan was also confronted with another cataclysmic threat: nuclear meltdown at a power plant damaged by the tremors. The disaster in Japan left more than 15,000 dead, and Tokyo estimates the destruction cost the country up to $300 billion. Economists said the disaster's medium-term economic consequences would be severe, since the Japanese economy remained both fragile and weighed down by a high debt-to-GDP ratio. From chips to ships, the global supply chain were tested by Japan's twin disasters. The country supplies up to a fifth of the world's electronics components and has significant motor and steel industries, production of which was badly interrupted. The world's biggest automaker Toyota suspended operations at all of its 12 Japanese factories after the quake. Honda and Nissan also reported damage to more than a dozen plants and facilities. Japan's electronics makers, with Sony, Toshiba, Canon, and Panasonic, as well as a slew of chemical firms making semiconductors, slashed production and halted orders for shipments abroad. Foreign firms reliant on Japanese goods were hard hit by the aftermath.
We're definitely affected because many of our materials come from Japan. We're now buying the materials for April, but we cannot predict when the materials could be sent here. It's a total disaster for the business in the quick hit zones. A lot of retail stores have disappeared in the tsunami. How to survive has become a major problem for everybody.
Market insiders say the reason behind the fear is that the production chain of Japanese enterprises is closely intertwined. The Bank of Japan, or BOJ, pumped cash into markets that had been badly shaken by the country's biggest ever earthquake. It injected 60 trillion yen to maintain liquidity in March. BOJ Governor Masaki Shirakawa said later in April that Japan's top priority was to fix the supply chain.
Top priority is now being placed on fixing the production and supply bottleneck of parts and materials with the cooperation of firms using them. At the same time, we are now seeing signs that alternate production has started in domestic factories located in places other than the affected areas.
Shirakawa saw accessible financing and growth rate as two pillars of recovery. The post-quake rebuilding efforts have stimulated the economy. Government consumption and corporate investment have grown following increases in industrial production and machinery orders. But with a huge money injection, Japan's government has seen a soaring public debt. Japan's current debt level has hit 200% of the country's annual GDP. On March the 24th, the international rating agency Moody's cut Japan's debt by 1 notch to AA3. The agency said downgrade was due to Japan's ballooning debt and frequently rotating administration.
Japan's catastrophe has left a trail of misery, and another disaster in Thailand also sparked global concerns. The country's worst flooding in half a century affected more than a third of the country's provinces and killed over 650 people nationwide. Meanwhile, the country's economy was also put in jeopardy.
The flooding was triggered by heavy monsoon rains in July, with tropical storms lashing 64 out of 77 provinces across the country. More than one-fifth of the country's 64 million people were affected. Tens of thousands of factories were swamped, causing about $4.5 billion in losses, and total economic damage was estimated at $23 to $28 billion. The Bank of Thailand Deputy Governor Suchata Kiraku says the widespread flooding will trim Thai GDP growth for this year to below 2.6%. On December the 6th, the Thai cabinet approved a reconstruction budget of $45 million, covering 313 historical sites in 41 provinces. Thai Deputy Prime Minister Yoon Yuth said due to the serious damage caused by this huge flood, it would take 3 to 6 years for society to recover. The biblical flood turned Southeast Asia's thriving industrial hub into a swamp overnight. The world number 2 exporter of hard drives had its industrial areas largely devastated by the flooding. Top hard drive makers Western Digital Corporation and Seagate Technologies suffered damages in their manufacturing lines, warning a possible parts shortage. However, hard drive is not the only industry hurt by the flood. Millions of cars were swept away or submerged in floodwaters as high as 3 meters. However, months after the disaster, Thai car making is getting back on its feet. Some companies whose factories were spared by the water but hit by supply shortages restarted production soon. They include Japanese giants Toyota, Mazda, and Mitsubishi. Having recently survived a serious natural disaster of its own in Japan, Mazda has announced multiple donations to help fund the recovery efforts in Thailand following the recent flooding.
Our plant is not in a flood area, However, our supplier affected by the flood, so if the supply stop, we have to stop the production. But thanks to the effort from supplier people and plant people and help from Japan, help from China, we can restart the production from November 14th for Master 2 and Master 3.
The Thai government is also working on a plan to help foreign investors recover from its flood-depleted factories by offering tax breaks and factory rehabilitation.
I think the progress of the action plan for rehabilitation is quite progress, more than the plan that we expect before.
Now let's turn to oil markets. In 2011, anti-government protests swept across the Middle East. Aside from fears of violence and hopes for political reform, global leaders were also nervously watching to see how the unrest would affect oil supplies. Meanwhile, concerns about Iran still weighed on the market. Western states ramped up sanctions over the oil-rich country's contentious nuclear program.
As a member of Organizations of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, Libya is one of the world's biggest oil producers and has the largest proven oil reserves in Africa. So when widespread anti-government protests kicked off there in February, global oil supply faced the prospect of major disruption. Crude prices rose sharply in response, hitting a high of $106.95 a barrel before dipping in late March. At that time, the most notable aspect of oil trade was its low volume. Factors weighing on trades included Middle Eastern unrest, Japan's nuclear crisis, Europe's sovereign debt domino effect, and America's protracted debt tussle. In July, crude prices tumbled after the International Energy Agency announced the release of 60 million barrels from its strategic reserve. However, unrest in Egypt, Syria, and Libya continue to hold down oil production. The European Central Bank, or ECB's recent lending to Eurozone banks, seems to have averted a post-Lehman-style credit crunch for the time being. But that temporary respite from gloom and doom has been offset by a ramping up of tensions with Iran and Western countries, keeping oil prices buoyant. In December, Iran's foreign ministry said global crude prices would more than double if West blocked its oil exports. Iran's first Vice President Mohammad Reza Rahimi also warned that Iran would close the Strait of the Hormuz if its oil exports were sanctioned by the West. Iran is the fourth largest oil exporter in the world, with the resource providing almost half the country's revenue. The Hormuz Strait is one of the world's most important passages for oil exports from states in the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency again sharply cut its forecast for the growth of global oil demand this year and next, this time by about 200,000 barrels per day. But the agency said the medium-term outlook was more comfortable than previous forecasts had suggested. The organization said global oil demand was now expected to average 89 million barrels a day by 2011 and rise to 90.3 million in 2012. On December the 14th, all 12 members of OPEC agreed to raise the output target to 30 million barrels a day for the first half of 2012. It was the first time for OPEC to change the output target in 3 years, but the group refrained from setting individual quotas for each member state.
I think the first quarter in oil prices will stay around slightly plus or minus at 100. I think it will be largely somewhere around 100. We do not see particular new factor that will trigger reduce in supply or increase supply. But of course, if Iran really take military action, then the oil price can go much higher.
The new limit by OPEC was in line with the current production and was considered to be enough to enrich the lean inventories.
The year of 2011 has meant booms or busts for different companies. Companies that in return affect our lives. In this special edition of Economy Report, we'll walk you through some of the company news that made headlines in the past year.
European bank Dexia on October the 4th announced bankruptcy and sought government help after liquidity crunch sent its shares into free fall. The French-Belgian bank had been built up twice in 3 years and was the first European bank paralyzed by the European debt crisis. Dexia had a global credit risk exposure of $700 billion, which was about twice as much as Greece's annual output. France, Belgium, and Luxembourg then reached a deal on October 10th to dismantle the failed Dexia. According to the agreement, Belgium will nationalize its stake, while Luxembourg's share will be sold to Qatari investors. France and Belgium were forced to step in to rescue the troubled bank as the two biggest shareholders. The European Commission, October 17th, gave provisional approval for the nationalization of Dexia's Belgium arm by the Belgian state. It gave the government 6 months to provide a new restructuring plan.
I think that is the only solution. You have to save the bank. If you don't save it, then you will become the first bank that falls because of the debt crisis. It will create a so-called domino effect or contagion effect over to the others.
The former chief executive and co-founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, died on October 5th at the age of 56 after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. Apple mourned the loss of his creative genius, saying his spirit will forever be the foundation of the company. Jobs' death triggered widespread tributes from Apple fans, politicians, and investors across the world.
I've used Apple products for at least the last 15 years, and it helped me launch a very successful business, so I owe Mr. Jobs a lot. So the least I could do was come down to the store, when I heard of his passing.
U.S. President Barack Obama had held him up as the embodiment of the American dream, saying Steve was among the greatest of American innovators, brave enough to think differently, bold enough to believe he could change the world, and talented enough to do it. With Jobs' passing, thoughts have turned to what the next technology era will look like and how his legacy will live on. Apple's newly installed CEO Tim Cook has already made his first big product announcement, the iPhone 4S. However, the device's latest iteration seemed to leave many analysts and investors feeling nonplussed. According to the latest data from market research company Comscore, Google's Android operating system maintained a sizable lead for the 3 months ending in August, while Apple's iOS remained in second place. Phone hacking by journalists at Britain's News of the World tabloid dominated global headlines last June and July. A police investigation revealed media mogul Rupert Murdoch's staff hired private investigators to hack into voicemail messages on up to 4,000 phones. As more and more allegations came to light, the dark arts of tabloid journalism were exposed to public scrutiny. Victims included politicians, lawyers, soldiers who had died in combat, their families, and a murdered teenage girl. On July 10th, the paper published its final edition after multiple blue-chip companies canceled their advertising contracts. Murdoch's company also published full-page advertisements in rival British newspaper saying, "We are sorry." Meanwhile, Murdoch was also forced to withdraw its $12 billion bid for British Sky Broadcasting in the face of public disgust and somewhat belated government opposition. The scandal then moved beyond the news of the world and rocked Britain's wider press, police, and politics. Even British Prime Minister David Cameron was implicated, with critics targeting his close relationship with Rupert Murdoch's papers. Cameron had hired former News of the World editor Andy Coulson as his press secretary. After months of defending Coulson against the phone hacking allegations, Cameron was finally forced to give him the sack.
People will, of course, make judgments about it. Of course, I regret, and I am extremely sorry about the furore it has caused. With 20/20 hindsight and all that has followed, I would not have offered him the job, and I expect that he wouldn't have taken it. But you don't make decisions in hindsight, you make them in the present. You live and you learn, and believe you me, I have learnt.
The thousands of phones hacked by the British tabloid reveal the scandalous practices of the newspaper. It denounces a culture of bullying and intimidation led by News International and raises wider questions about the ethics of the world media in general.
That's all for today's Economy Report. Thanks for staying with us. Bye for now.